Chapter 9, IS Curve, Investment Savings Curve. IS curve is an investment savings curve. The IS curve looks like this. On the y-axis, it's the interest rate, the real interest rate, and the x-axis is the output in dollars. So this is the total output, aggregate output. And we see that as interest rate falls, that output increases. And that this area below this line is the area where there is excess demand. There's more demand than what goods are available. So what happens is these points try to go and meet at this line. So this curve basically says at this point, the goods market is in equilibrium. There is neither excess demand nor excess supply. The supply equals the demand at each of these points. So depending on the interest rate, the output is going to be in equilibrium, meaning whatever you produced is what is expected. So how did we get to this IS curve? How did we get to the relation between interest rate R and output Y, the aggregate output Y? That's the crux of this chapter, right? But let's start with that, hey, we're going to get here, but how did we get here, right? So remember, this is short-run analysis. This chapter is short-run analysis. We're going to build a model for analyzing the equilibrium at the short runs. And this is the Keynesian model that we have started looking at. So remember, this all started during Great Depression, when there was a 25% drop in unemployment, 35% drop in output in the 1930s. And so there was no explanation as to why the drop in unemployment, drop in output was not being caught back up. Meaning, if it was that cheap to hire people because there were lots of unemployed people, why were they not being hired? Why was there not enough investment because it was cheap to get people? So the theory was that it was a negative cycle. When the demand stopped, then overall the output also stopped because there was lack of aggregate demand. So this is the Keynesian model that we're going to look into. So let's start with how did we get to the IS curve? Planned expenditure, YPE. What is planned expenditure? So let's start with this example. Planned expenditure is basically for a given country. What are all the planned expenditures? Like, what are you going to spend on goods? What are you going to spend on services? How much you're going to consume? How much you're going to export? So everyone has a plan. And if you combine everyone's plan, you get the country's plan as to what is this country going to do. So that is their plan, right? Every country has a plan, because if you sum up all of the people, you will get the total plan of the country. If those people are successful at executing their plan that says, hey, we're going to produce $10 worth of goods and services, right? The plan for the country, let's say, is to produce $10 goods and services. And then let's say the country realizes that, hey, the demand for what they produce was only $8, right? So they produced $10, but then it was only $8 was usable because people only needed $8. So when aggregate demand is not equals to planned expenditure, what happens? You try to reduce your prices and you start to produce less, right? You produce less. So what the equilibrium basically says is aggregate output or aggregate demand, if it's equal to planned expenditure, then there's the equilibrium, right? What you plan and what you consume is whatever you had planned and you actually produce was actually demanded for. So if your aggregate demand and your planned expenditure and aggregate output are the same, right? What you produce is what you need. What you produce is what you need. So if Y equals YPE, right? YPE is planned expenditure. Planned expenditure is what you think is the aggregate demand. So if your aggregate output Y, which we know, is equal to planned expenditure YPE, then we are at equilibrium. That's one of these points. So now let's look at what is your planned expenditure, right? What is it? What are the big components? And there are 4 components of planned expenditure. It is C plus I plus G plus NX. We've looked at this in the GDP calculation equation in chapter 3 and 4. But planned expenditure is nothing but what you plan to consume, all your expenses of consumption. If you have a plan to buy a car, the nation aggregate would have a plan to buy, let's say, 20,000 cars, right? If you have a plan to make an investment, it could be a fixed investment in a factory, it could be investment in an inventory, whatever that is, whatever your plan for investment is, that's I. Consumption is C, investment is I, G is government expenses. The government can purchase goods and services through the fire department, the police department. They could also pay, they could have transfers. So government expenses. This government expense currently is without transfers, but let's think about all the expenses that the government has. Net exports is like for all that you produce, part of your plan, how much you're going to export. Let's say the United States exports goods and services to the other nation because there's lots of demand for the US goods, then this is your planned net exports. So your planned expenditure YPE equals C plus I plus G plus NX, all of those expenses, if you equal that to the aggregate demand or the aggregate output, then you have equilibrium. So now let's break down each of these components as to how did we get to this YPE. So let's look at C. Consumption is C equals C bar plus MPC times YD. So we know C bar is basically autonomous consumption, which you can think about C bar as consumption that is not related to interest rate. Let's say you have a small baby in your home. You need milk powder at some point. So you're not going to look at the interest rate to buy that milk powder. So that is autonomous, meaning you're going to buy it no matter what, right? So there's certain basic things that you're going to buy because you need to buy, right? That is autonomous. And that is considered exogenous or fixed. This bare minimum that you need, so C bar. So what you consume has the autonomous part, which is not negotiable. It doesn't matter what the world says. I need, to drink certain amount of water, so I'm going to go drink it, and it's going to cost $10. Okay, $10. I'm going to go drink it. So then C bar. MPC is the marginal propensity to consume. Marginal propensity to consume the extra dollar. So let's say I give you $10 of income. Will you spend all of that $10? Maybe, but most people will save at least 1 cent. So they'll maybe save $1, right? So $9 I might save, and I can have I can save $1 and then I can spend $9, right? So then my marginal propensity to consume when I get a $10 income and I spend 9 is 0.9. So if I get a $10 income and I spend $9, then my MPC is 9 over 10, which is 0.9. It's basically saying for every dollar that you get, how much are you going to save? How much are you going to spend or consume? So 0.9 is what I would have spent for every dollar of income. So $9 is going to be gone. So it's basically saying, hey, for what is your marginal propensity to consume as a country? And then YD is the demand. Demand is basically output minus taxes, right? If I give you $10, you have to first pay your taxes. So the taxes are out. So YD equals Y minus T. So whatever, $10 minus $2, let's say taxes. So YD is actually 8. So even if you make $10, YD becomes 8 because you take out taxes. So then C equals C bar plus MPC times Y minus T. So we just substitute YD here, we get this one. And C equals C bar plus MPC Y minus T minus CR. What is this CR? C, small c, is the consumption responsiveness to real interest rate. So there's some autonomous part of consumption, but there is also this small c, which basically says, based on the interest rate, I might consume higher or less, right? Let's take an example. Let's say you make the $10 income, you pay $2 taxes, you get $8 as YD, but then you realize, hey, if I put this $8 and the interest rate is 10%, then I can get like 80 cents, right? So if the interest rate is high, your C, small c, will be low. Consumption responsiveness to real interest rate. So how does your consumption change based on the interest rate, right? So we have to subtract that. Why? Because it's negative impact on consumption. Higher the interest rate, lower the consumption, because people want to save more and they want to make more money from the saving. So these are the parts of consumption equation. It depends on the autonomous consumption, depends on marginal propensity to consume as a nation, depends on taxes, depends on the marginal, depends on small c, which is the consumption responsiveness to real interest rate R. So these are the parts of the consumption. So now we can substitute c here with c bar plus MPC, y minus t minus CR, right? So now we're going to do the same with investments, which is I. And then we're going to do for net exports, NX, right? And once we do this, we'll get this formula, this large formula. But let's just go slowly. Investments could be fixed investments. If you buy a factory or a plant, then it's a fixed investment. It's not part of your inventory, which is the second type of investment. If let's say you produce $10 worth of good and you only are able to sell $2, then you have invested $8 in your inventory. So that's your inventory investment. When inventory investments keep going up, that's bad, because you're just storing things in your warehouse. You got to be selling it. So that is a negative loop. So it actually reduces output. You get a feedback that says, hey, stop producing more because my inventory is getting filled in the warehouse. So investments could be fixed or inventory based. Investments is I bar minus DRI. We all know what I bar is. I bar is basically autonomous investments. Investments that you will do no matter what, right? So it doesn't depend on the interest rate, but there is some part, DRI. D is basically investment responsiveness to real interest rate. So investment depends greatly on interest rate as well. And then RI is basically interest rate at time I equals R plus F bar. What is F bar? F bar is the frictional cost. F bar is the finance friction or the frictional cost. If you go to a company and all the paperwork that they do to check your credit score, to get you to, put something as a collateral, the bank employees are spending time to do that paperwork. All of that is friction. So if friction increases, your RI increases. And the R is the real rate of interest, but real rate of interest plus the friction is the actual rate of interest. So that is RI. So you substitute RI to R. Here you get I bar minus D times R plus F bar. So if friction increases, real interest rate increases, investment goes down. Right? So now we've got investment. So we can substitute I here, C here. And then G, let's assume that's exogenous and it's G bar. The government autonomously doesn't depend on interest rate. Same for taxes. Let's assume T equals T bar. But net exports does depend on the interest rate. NX equals NX bar minus XR. What is X? X is the export responsiveness to real interest rate. So net exports, investments, consumption, they all have some factor that is autonomous, the first part, and then some factor that is dependent on the interest rate, CR, D plus F, D, R plus F, XR, right? All have R part of this, right? So this is the interest rate part, and this is the autonomous part. So once we know all of these, and if we can substitute here, we get this equation. YPE equals C bar plus I bar minus DF. It's a long, you can write this long equation, but the key piece to remember is you have to simplify. After you substitute, you'll have to simplify to get to this simple format, wherein there are two parts. This first part is the autonomous part. I've grouped all of this together, and then the second part is the interest rate driven part. You see here, R is multiplied by this part, and here 1 over 1 minus MPC is multiplied by this part. So the intuition to take out of this is basically output is, so this is a positive number, right? MPC is less than 1. So this entire is a positive number. So there's an autonomous part of output and there's interest rate driven, but there's a minus, meaning as interest rate goes up, output goes down, right? So now we have this equation. This equation is nothing but the IS curve, right? You see, when R goes down, output goes up, right? Output goes up, R goes down, output goes up. So this one is how we got the IS curve, right? The aggregate output, the relationship between output, aggregate output, and the real interest rate. So now we've seen how we got the equation, what that curve is. It's basically telling us as interest rates go down, people borrow more money, and then output goes up. So now let's look at some of these variables individually. We've seen this, but as consumption goes up, what happens to the IS curve? Let's look at this. As consumption goes up, output increases. If you have to increase the output, you'll have to shift the IS curve to the right because it goes from Y1 to Y2. So the curve shifts to the right. So see, the difference here is that if you just change the interest rate here, then what happens? If you change the interest rate, also output goes up, right? So if you go from 5% interest rate, which has output of this one, and let's say you go to 2%, then output of this one. So Y1 to Y2. But here what has happened is if you just change the interest rate, then the curve doesn't shift right or left. The point shifts from here to here. So it's the shift on the IS curve. But if these variables shift, the autonomous variables shift, then the curve shifts along, meaning the GDP shifts, the output shifts. Here, if the autonomous consumption shifts, the output curve shifts to the right. Same for investment, autonomous government expense. When that happens, the output shifts, the IS curve shifts to the right. Same for net exports. These are the only two. When taxes increase, when you increase your taxes, your consumption goes down because you have less disposable income, right? When you have less disposable income, you're gonna have less planned expenditure to consume, so your output goes down. So increase in taxes shifts the IS curve to the left. Same for increase in friction. Increase the friction. If you increase the friction, then investments go down because frictional cost is eating up into investments. So the IS curve shifts. So we now know when it shifts. There are various reasons why it shifts. Autonomous part, autonomous consumption, autonomous government spending, investments, it shifts the GDP, it shifts the output, shifts the planned expenditure outwards, right? So I've tried to summarize all of this in terms of how it shifts based on the interest rate. So as friction goes up, interest rate goes up, consumption goes down, investment goes down, NX goes down, net export goes down, total output, planned expenditure goes down, right? So as R goes up, this goes down. But then as our interest rate goes up, inflation goes down. This is a separate topic, but you see how this all is connected. Similarly, if autonomous consumption goes up or investment goes up or autonomous net export goes up, then output goes up. So there's an autonomous part and there's a non-autonomous part. And there is this tax part. as taxes go down, all of these go up. And as they go up, output planned expenditure goes up. So this is the IS curve. The beauty is that this is the same as the curve that we saw in chapter 4, where if you put y equals c plus I plus g plus nx, if you make g and nx equals 0, assume, then you get y equals c plus I, right? And y minus c is nothing but savings. What you produce minus what you consume equals savings. So S equals I. So that's how it got the name IS curve, investment and savings curve, right? So when your investments and savings are equal, you can also derive it that way. But we derived it through this equation, and now we understand that there is this autonomous part of the economy, and then there's a big part that's driven by the interest rate. So the government has a huge role to play when it determines that the output is way below its potential, is to cut interest rate, is to stimulate all of these factors that shifts the IS curve to the left, reduce taxes, increase government fiscal spending, increase net exports, right? Reduce friction. When you do that, your economy, your planned expenditure goes up. So this is the first part of this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model that we're trying to build. This is the IS curve. We now know the relationship between interest rate and planned expenditure, planned output, and how we can shift it. Awesome.